Thank you for coming. Those of you who are regulars probably already have schedules. I don't see any in the back, but there should be some somewhere in the library. They are blue. Next week, Rosalie Strom will be reviewing The Wild Duck Chase Inside the Strange and Wonderful World of the Federal Duck Stamp Contest. Who doesn't know what a duck stamp is? Well, it's a license that you get to hunt ducks. Is that? I don't know, but I guess we'll find out. So, those of you who have attended my reviews before know I usually choose nonfiction books, often rather offbeat ones. But when I'm reading fiction, it's usually historical novels or especially detective fiction. In fact, the very first Tuesday review I gave in 1991 was titled The Perfect Detective Novel. This was a rather misleading title because many of the audience were hoping I would identify a specific work, when what I was really doing was describing the qualities that made a detective novel perfect for me. One of those was that ideally my perfect detective novel is one of a series. Most of you know how satisfying it is when you have read a book you really like to discover that the author has written other books. It can be a pleasure to follow an author's new books from year to year, but even better if there's already a good stock of previously published work. That is the case with Martha Grimes's Richard Jury novels. There are 26 of them, enough to last a year at least if you're a leisurely reader, or 6 months if you gobble them up. As you can see from your handout, every one of those books is available in the Baldwin County Library System, some of them in multiple locations and/or formats. Most are available here in Fairhope, though often only in large print, which is what the LP means on your handout. I will reassure you at the outset that I have no intention of reviewing all 26 of these books. Instead, I plan to tell you a little, actually a lot, about Martha Grimes and her writing methods, a little about the characters and themes of the books, and then for the fun part, some background on the pubs for which the books are named. Because each book in the series, with a couple of exceptions that I'll get into, is named for a British pub. You can see the names on your handout, and they are all pretty interesting. If you do decide to read the books, I recommend you begin with the first one, The Man with a Load of Mischief, which introduces most of the continuing characters and describes the settings in Long Piddleton and London that feature in most of the books. This is a recommendation that would be seconded by Jury Sergeant Alfred Wiggins, who is a great fan of Ed McBain's novels. In The Winds of Change, when he is in hospital, Jury visits him. Jury lifted the book from the turned-down sheet over Wiggins's chest. Another 87th Precinct novel? It's an early one. I find it's best to go back to the beginning and get to know the characters. Jury had thumbed to the page that listed all the books in the series. Christ, he's written hundreds of them. To work your way up from the beginning, you'd have to be born again. Looking at Wiggins's pale, reproachful face and soulful eyes, he thought maybe he already was. So, in addition to the 26 books in the Richard Jury series, Grimes has written a number of books in other series, including the Emma Graham series, which is based on her own childhood, the Andy Oliver series, which focuses on prevention of cruelty to animals, and a number of other books, including a memoir written with her son about alcoholism and recovery. Grimes's first novel was published in 1981, when she was 50 years old. Although she didn't make the bestseller list until 1987, her books did receive recognition before that. As you can see, a Nero Wolfe Award, Mystery Guild Award, and she is a bit piqued that she never received an Edgar, but she was somewhat mollified when the Mystery Writers Association, which presents the Edgar, named her a Grand Master in 2012. Despite the number of interviews she has given and public appearances she has made, Grimes still describes her as a very private person, and it was very difficult to learn much about her early life. She was initially pretty cagey about her age, and although she frequently referenced some of her early experiences, I found it very difficult to fit them into a timeline. This slide shows the earliest photo of her I could find, along with the most recent one. But let's get to some details. She was born in Pittsburgh, lived there with her parents until she was nearly 6, when her father died. The family spent summers at the Mountain Lake Hotel, of which her mother was part owner. But after her father died, she and her mother and brother Bill moved to Mountain Lake permanently, and her mother took over the running of the hotel. We can get some idea of her childhood from the Emma Graham novels, which Grimes acknowledges are autobiographical, though she says Emma is a bolder version of herself, the person she would have liked to be. She and Bill, called Will in the Emma Graham books, were always close. As an adult, he owned an antique shop in Maryland near her homes, and he is credited as the photographer in some of her author photos. Mountain Lake Park in Garrett County, Maryland, was founded by a group of Methodist ministers and businessmen in 1881, based on the model of Chautauqua in New York. It was intended to provide multicultural enrichment programs, including lectures, performances, music, and recreation in the clean, cool mountain air of the Alleghenies. It became a popular tourist resort. The leading hotel in Mountain Lake Park was the Mountain Lake Hotel. The Mountain Lake Park Association built and furnished this hotel in 1882 at a cost of some $9,500, exclusive of the 12 lots that went with it. A year later, it was sold to a relative of one of the directors for $5,000. The hotel lawns and grove covered 8 acres. It offered, quote, situation commanding magnificent mountain outlook, broad verandas, cheerful rooms, steam heat, open fires, electric call bells, bathrooms, and the best system of drainage in the mountains. The location is most convenient to railroad station, auditorium, Hall of Philosophy, and Mountain Lake. By the time the Grimeses lived there, Mountain Lake Park was no longer so desirable, and the hotel was less popular, and it is no longer in existence today. We can assume that Martha, like Bill, attended school in Oakland, Maryland, the nearest real town. Martha is mentioned as a sophomore in the 1947-48 yearbook called The Acorn of Oakland High School, so she presumably graduated in 1950. After high school, she attended and graduated from the University of Maryland. At 24 or 25, she was working for the government to pull together enough money for graduate school, also at the University of Maryland. When she got her master's, however, she got a job as a teaching assistant at the University of Iowa. She writes, I had applied for teaching positions at several universities, back in the days when a person could not only get a job, but actually choose the job she wanted. I went for several interviews, Colorado, Iowa, and some college in New England. I chose Iowa. I'm not sure why. I was impressed by the person who interviewed me, by the campus, by the teaching load. She was dating a young man who was in a poetry workshop, and I said to him, do you think I could get into that? I've never written poetry. And he said, oh, yes, sure, just write something. So I did, and I got in. She enjoyed writing poetry, but found it very difficult. Eventually, she returned to Maryland to teach at Frostburg State College. It was there that she met Van Hollen, who was also a writer, as his college newspaper testifies, because he was the editor of the Highland Echo at Maryville College. They married and had a son. This marriage certificate is one of the few dates in Grimes's early life that can be definitely pinned down. And this just shows you that you can find almost anything on the internet. You will note that his name was actually Edwin Van Holland, but he went by Van. All of the stuff in his school newspaper referred to him as Van. Grimes later said, "I knew before, during, and after that this marriage was a mistake of monumental proportions, and yet I did nothing to stop it or end it for 5 years. For years. 5 years elapsed before I left. A large part of the problem was that they were both alcoholics. Martha was a functioning alcoholic or maintenance drinker until about 1990 when she finally got sober. After the divorce, Van went to the University of Indiana for a master's degree in English. He later became the editor of the Dundalk Eagle in Dundalk, Maryland, a suburb of Baltimore. Martha lived in a trailer and took whatever job she could find. She writes, "I worked as a secretary for a man who did some sort of consulting for the University of West Virginia. He informed me one day when the paychecks rolled in that his withholding tax was more than my salary. I thanked him for sharing." Eventually, she got a teaching job at Montgomery College, and she and Kent moved frequently around the area, 5 or 6 times by the time he was 6, Kent says. After Christmas 1974, Martha and Kent moved from the D.C. suburbs to Denmead, a tiny village near Portsmouth in Hampshire, where Kent finished 4th grade. If this sounds a bit random, she later explained that she went there because of a man, but it didn't work out. She says that the relationship with the man, her love affair with the man did not work out, but her love affair with England did. They returned to England in the summers when Kent was 8 to 12, so 1973 to 1977. Though in 1976, she was teaching English at the University of Hawaii. She hated the 15 years that she taught at Montgomery College. She said the curriculum was dumbed down, faculty were pompous asses. She later reflected when she was in 1992, when she was teaching in the creative writing program at Johns Hopkins, she said there was not one pompous ass in the whole program. They're all at Montgomery College. Frustrated as a poet, Grimes noticed that most of her poems were about violence, had a strong narrative, and read like poems written by someone who should be writing prose. She loved the mystery novels of Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers and found the idea of writing them herself compelling. So in the late 1970s, she was teaching and writing at the same time. She switched from poetry and started her first novel, which was never published. Writing in the morning, before or between classes, often sitting in bed and writing on a yellow legal pad, she penned a mystery about, she says, an American English professor who ties up with a couple of other people, not exactly crooks, and they steal various things. It was never published, but it did contain the forerunner of Melrose Plant. She hit pay dirt in 1977 when she got the idea for The Man with a Load of Mischief. She sent the manuscript over the transom to over a dozen publishers, one at a time, until it was pulled out of the slush pile by Little Brown, which published it in 1981 when she was 50 years old. And she talked about how she got the idea for the name when she was sitting in a hot shop in Bethesda reading a book about English pub names. And she came across the name and she said, "Suddenly I knew what I wanted to do, write books set in English pubs." And now she says she can't write a book without a pub name. It was published with 3,000 copies, which is a pretty small first printing. Her books weren't an instant success. As we've seen, she didn't hit the bestseller list until book number 9, The Five Bells and Bladebone. But this photo shows that The Deer Leap, which is number 7, had been published in trade paperback, which is always a good sign. I had to do some pretty hard scrutiny to figure out what book that was that she's looking at. But in fact, she has copies, hardback copies of some of her other books there in the book stand beside her. I'm going to show you a few more photos. This is one she especially liked. In 1992, she was described as pink-complexioned with golden-tipped hair, with the height and rangy presence of Julia Child without the extra upholstery. There's even sometimes a similar flutiness of voice, though Grimes's ranges from feathery to scratchy to deep and dramatic. Another article mentioned her gray-green eyes and throaty laugh and a voice lightly pocked by spasmodic dysphonia. And here are a few more photos. The 2007 photo was used on the dust jacket of several of her books, and other photos appeared with articles about her. And aside from one New York Times article, most of the articles I found online were from local papers. The Washington Post, Washingtonian Magazine, or local papers in Bethesda, Maryland, or cities where she bought vacation homes, Sarasota, Florida, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. Yet she was little known even on her home turf. A 2008 article in Washingtonian Magazine titled Woman of Mystery, this was a popular title, there were at least 2 articles with that title, began, "She's written 30 novels and sold 5 million books worldwide, but few Washingtonians recognize Martha Grimes, and that's okay with her." Martha Grimes was about to have her picture taken, so she walked to get her hair done at a salon near her Capitol Hill home. Grimes explained to a stylist as she was leaving, "I have an interview with USA Today." "As good as you look," the stylist said, "you'll get the job." So let's talk about the characters in the books. The first one we meet is Melrose Plant in The Man with a Load of Mischief. We get a good look at Melrose and his environs before Richard Jury ever appears on the scene. And in fact, Grimes has said that she initially planned to make Melrose her central character. He is depicted with a lot of humor, and so it makes sense that she would suggest that the best actor to play the character would be Hugh Laurie or Hugh Grant. There's no question that Melrose would make a good leading man in the Hugh Grant style, though his quirky humor is perhaps better suited to Hugh Laurie. As we will see later, much of the comedy in the books comes from seeing Melrose as a fish out of water. He is a man of leisure and never seems to have to ask the price of anything. He seems to have incredibly deep pockets. There's never any problem about buying anything. He is very attractive, 6 feet tall, and this is... When we first meet Melrose, he is in the Jack and Hammer pub, sitting, quote, in the curve of the bay, drinking Old Peculiar and reading Rimbaud. We later learn that the book was his 40th day birthday to himself, an early edition of Les Illuminations, for which he had paid a ridiculous price, telling himself he deserved it, then wondering why. This tells us that he reads French poetry and is wealthy. It is only later that we learn the other facts shown on the slide. Which are, in fact, the disgruntled musings of his Aunt Agatha, who is constantly at odds with him. She is an American of the worst type, a terrible snob. She married Melrose's uncle, who subsequently died, leaving her with no title and little money, though Melrose's father had provided her with a cottage and an annual allowance. That her own husband had not been the 8th Earl of Cavernous and 12th Viscount Ardrey had always been a searing wound. The Honorable Robert Ardrey had been instead the useless younger brother of Melrose Plant's father. Where her nephew had dropped the title of Lord Ardrey, Agatha had picked it up and dusted it off, transforming herself overnight into Lady Ardrey. She cannot understand why Melrose would have given up his titles, and it's not until the Lamorna wink that we learn the true reason, although he gives some ridiculous excuses. After a long paragraph citing Melrose's illustrious lineage down hundreds of years to Jury, who says it makes his head spin, she says, "I know, and all handed to my nephew straight on a silver platter. Lord Ardrey, 8th Earl of Cavernous, and all the rest, a title given to him without so much as lifting a finger, and then the silly man gave it back." So she had to satisfy herself with her made-up title, and the title was now the one department where she had bested him. She had nothing else to offer as competition because he was not terribly rich, but rich enough, not terribly handsome, but handsome enough, not terribly tall, but tall enough, and so on. And we hear that he is the chair of French Romantic Poetry at the University of London, although I don't think this is ever really comes up much in subsequent books, because mostly we see him at leisure. It would be easy to trivialize Melrose as comic relief, and indeed he is often very silly. But in fact, in comparison to the dark and brooding Jury, he is a much lighter character, not so introspective, and in a position to be impulsive and whimsical. Melrose's beer is also introduced in the first paragraph of the first book. Not that Melrose would ever have drunk it from a bottle or can. He expects it to be on draft. In one instance, when he does have to settle, when asked if he would like it in a glass, he replies, "Doesn't it come in a glass?" Grimes's copy editors do her no favors. In the later books, it is often misspelled, as you can imagine. In an interview with Sarasota Magazine in 2005, when Grimes was asked who should play the darkly romantic Jury, she replied, "Clive Owen, because he's too cool for words, or perhaps Colin Firth." So that gives you a little bit of a mental picture of them. He is a much more complicated character than Melrose. Like Melrose, he is an orphan, but his parents' deaths were much more traumatic because he did not grow up as a child of privilege. He lived briefly with his uncle's family, but the uncle also died, and Jury spent most of his childhood in an unpleasant group home. The story about all of this varies considerably throughout the books. Early on, we're told that his mother died when he was 7. Later, it's 5 or 6. And it says, for 7 years after that, he had been handed round from aunts to cousins and back again until he had at 14 simply lit out on his own. The group home comes into it in a later book. But basically the deal is that his parents were killed in a traumatic manner, and he had a very unfortunate growing up. We are told that Jury lives in Islington. Though his address is somewhat disguised, one researcher has determined that his flat was in one of these terraced houses on Gerrard Road in Islington. He shared the building with Mrs. Wasserman in the garden flat, and later Carol Ann Palutsky comes on the scene, and later still Stan Keeler. The landlord has been persuaded to make Carol Ann the renting agent for the building, and she ruthlessly eliminates any prospective tenant who threatens to attract Jury's attention. He's old enough to be her father. He treats her very paternally, and she's an amazing character. But anytime, like a suitable couple or looks at the flat or much less an attractive woman, she finds some reason to not rent the flat to them until finally Stan Keeler comes, and he's a musician, and she approves of him. These are some of the themes that we'll explore in the Jury novels. Beginning with animal welfare. Grimes is a vegetarian and very much interested in animal welfare and the prevention of cruelty to animals, which is the subject of her Andy Oliver series. In fact, she donated 2/3 of the royalties from Biting the Moon to animal welfare organizations. We often see her in pictures with her. I guess these are all 3 dogs, but she had also cats as pets. Animals, especially dogs, play an important role in many of her books. One critic wrote, "Her depiction of animals has been met with mixed reactions, as many appreciate the presence of cats Cyril, of which you'll hear more, Schrödinger, and Morris, and dogs Sparky, Arnold, and Mungo, while others object to her anthropomorphic animals that are capable of rational thought and speak to each other and the reader." This is something that comes up more in the later books. And then the next concept is kidjap. In Rainbow's End, one of the flamboyant characters is a Hollywood agent who is proposing proposing a remake of The Wizard of Oz, and says that Dorothy got a crummy deal and the ending was a total cheat. She went through hell to find this wizard, so when she does, she discovers he's a fake. But it's the greatest kidjap picture of all time, classic. And jury says, "Kid what?" Kidjap, kid in jeopardy. You got a kidjap situation, you got prime box office, guaranteed. So many of the books feature kidjap, even before this concept is introduced, but it is an idea very familiar to jury. As someone who had a difficult childhood himself, he is especially drawn to children who are abused or neglected, but his own childhood is reflected in the characters of children who, despite their condition, can hold their own. Among these are Bertie Makepeace, who has been effectively abandoned by his mother, but is mothered by women in the community and protected by his dog, and Jessica Ashcroft, an orphan heiress being raised by an uncle. She has exhausted numerous governesses because she rejects and drives away anyone she thinks might be attractive to her uncle. Benny Keegan is a homeless boy who supports himself doing odd jobs. He's a very likable chap. With the help of his very intelligent dog, Sparky, befriends Gemma Trim, an orphan being raised for reasons that are not explained until right near the end. He's being raised by a wealthy family. And best of all, Patty Hay in the Knowledge, who is part of a team of apparently homeless kids who operate an intelligence bureau in collaboration with cab drivers. She leads Melrose a lively dance from London to Africa, all on her own, flying by herself on tickets that she manages to she finds somebody else's ticket that has a similar name. I mean, I cannot go into enough about Patty Hay. She is quite a character. One of the best reasons to keep reading Martha Grimes, even when you can't make head or tail of the plot, is that the books can be so funny. Among the amusing characters are jury sergeant Albert Wiggins, who is constantly ill and constantly discovering new and more disgusting cures. He's always putting something like charcoal biscuits that he puts in his tea. The battles between Superintendent Racer and the cat Cyril, who repeatedly outsmarts him, are moments of comic relief. Cyril is befriended by Jury and Wiggins and Fiona Klingmore, but Racer just outdoes himself trying to find ways to get rid of Cyril, and he's the cat that came back. Racer's secretary, Fiona Klingmore, is first described this way. She was wearing one of those 1940 outfits she seemed to like, black high-heeled shoes with a button strap across the instep, tight black skirt, black nylon blouse with long, full sleeves, which always made her look en negligee. As usual, her neckline was down and her skirt was up. Fiona always seemed to wear her clothes at half-mast. Perhaps she was mourning chastity, thought Jury. As noted, Melrose provides a lot of the comedy because he is always being put in impossible situations. Somehow he always manages to rise to the occasion, but it's always amusing because since he is a layman, jury calls on him to work undercover in the most ridiculous ways. As it said, as a gardener, horse trainer, horse purchaser, antiques appraiser, a librarian, and he always is having to figure out how to do this, and somehow or other he always manages to be accepted. And when all else fails, he has a stock of old business cards that still have his titles on them. And so when necessary, he becomes Lord Ardry, which paves the way for a lot of things. It is impossible to say enough about Aunt Agatha. She is probably the most prominent of the running jokes. Her snobbery, her greed, her gluttony, her ignorance, and her obliviousness of what a laughingstock she is are all played for laughs. She has her own house, but she mostly spends her time over at Ardry End, eating up all of Melrose's food, like she's the man who came to dinner. She just imposes on him all of the time, and she's a complete idiot. And then Diane de Morney, speaking of idiots, she is introduced in the later books, and another long Piltonian who is hard to believe. Diane's shtick is that she can appear to be an expert on anything by learning all there is to know about one small facet of a subject. And so that makes her sound very learned, despite the fact that she knows nothing about the rest of it. Drury and Melrose have an amazing tolerance for absurdity. One example is Melrose's encounter with the War Boys family in I Am the Only Running Footman. Proprietors of the Mortal Man in Devon, where he is staying, the whole family, including their dog, are so clumsy that Melrose is lucky to escape with his life. Similar slapstick humor is seen with repeated encounters with the Cripps family of London, whose flasher father and elephantine mother mostly neglect their constantly increasing brood of outrageous and unmanageable children. And incredibly, Grimes has said that this family was based on fact, which she must have definitely stretched a little bit. The final theme of the book is that both Melrose and Drury are unlucky in love. As Grimes notes, readers wouldn't really want them to be successful. It has frequently been observed that though detective married couples such as Nick and Nora Charles and Agatha Christie's Tommy and Tuppence may be fun, single detectives who marry tend to be less interesting. Lord Peter Wimsey is an example that's frequently given. Richard Drury, I swear, any woman he meets in the book is going to come to a bad end because he is just cursed. And then he and Melrose both reflect on the fact that in almost every book, invariably the object of his affection spurns him, dies, is murdered, or turns out to be a murderer. Many of the interviews with Martha Grimes focus on her plots and writing methods. She has frequently said that she is terrible at plotting. A friend of hers gave her the advice, once you have the characters, all you need is a plot. But she admits, I never have a plot before I start writing. I usually have the setting because ordinarily I use the pub in its current setting. When I go to England, she says in one interview, and I do this once, sometimes twice a year, I never stay very long. I don't take notes. The only research I do is the accidental coming upon of a pub, the name of which I think is just fantastic. And then I go in, and that's the research. I like to sort of sit around and let it seep in, and I've got a fairly good memory for English settings, places I've been. Any research I do back here. In another interview, she said, I don't write outlines and I don't write summaries. I don't know what the end is until I get there. I have a funny feeling that the book is in the subconscious and I'm just sort of excavating to find it. In The Five Bells and Blade Bones, Grimes was 50 pages from the end and clueless about the culprit. Then, while she was standing on a corner in her Capitol Hill neighborhood, the solution appeared out of the fog. I'm sure it's not as haphazard as I'm making it sound, she says, almost apologetically. I'm sure it's more controlled than I know of in the moment. Another interview quoted her as saying, "It's often a real struggle to put a murder in my books," adding she's much more comfortable constructing scenes with page after page of witty dialogue among the recurring characters, or neatly slicing and dicing whatever subject strikes her. In another interview, she said, "The hard part is the murder, figuring out why they were done and who did them." She freely admits that her books are not police procedurals. She has no idea how Scotland Yard actually operates. And she actually went to Scotland Yard at one point and wanted to learn more about them. And someone told her, "This is not America. We don't do tours." In many of her books, she has Jury on vacation or on medical leave, which releases him from having to adhere to procedure. Not that he ever does. When he's chasing a lead, he frequently dodges calls from Superintendent Racer, who is dissatisfied even when Jury solves a case, although, of course, Racer takes credit for solving it. And then timing is extremely fluid in the series, and Grimes doesn't seem to have taken any care to make her timeline consistent. So dates and ages given in one book are often contradicted in another. She compensates for this by introducing older characters who actually do remember the war. These include the old men who sit around at Melrose's club, which is introduced about halfway through the season. It's called Borings, which is a pretty good name for it. And then there's also a character named Sir Oswald Maples, who had been a cryptologist at Bletchley Park during the war. And they have memories of the war, so that helps. Now, the pubs. Although pubs provide the names of all of the books, some of them feature more prominently than others. Asked how much time she spends in the pub, Grimes replied, "I go in, look around, and will write one or two notes, mainly about what's hanging on the walls. After I've written a lot of the book, I will go back to England and go back to that pub again. I do that a lot. It's not so much the pub as the area I want to see again. I want to spend a little more time in the area because it's the setting itself that's important." Asked whether she had had a pint in every pub that provided a name, she replied, "Until lately." In a public appearance, she clarified that since getting sober, she doesn't drink beer in pubs. And she says, "I have been in every pub except for the Old Contemptibles, and there were a couple of others that were logistically impossible to get to." She notes that many of the pubs have been changed and modernized, as we shall see. Probably the most important pub in the series is one that does not provide the name for a book. The Jack and Hammer is the setting for the first scene in the first book, The Man with a Load of Mischief, and appears, I think, in every other book. This is a pub that Grimes could not possibly have been in because it is in the fictitious town of Long Piddleton in North Hampshire. If ever there was a pub with this name elsewhere, I have not been able to find any trace of it, but it is described in loving detail in every book. It is where the core group of Long Piddletonians, Melrose Plant, Marshall Trueblood, Vivian Rivington, and sometimes Diane de Mornay, meet almost daily for a drink or a meal, sometimes joined by Richard Jury, and more often than anyone wants, by Melrose's Aunt Agatha. The pub takes its name from the animated blacksmith that is part of its sign, as described on the slide. There is a beam with a blacksmith who strikes the hours on his forge with a 17th century forge hammer. I think Grimes must have seen something like the blacksmith figure she describes here, and it is regrettable that the sign was not reproduced when the Brace of Pheasants pub in Dorset was rebranded as the Jack and Hammer for the German television adaptation of The Man with a Load of Mischief. None of Grimes's books have been made into movies or television series except this German television series, which did cover a couple of the books. I don't know how successful it was. Obviously, it's not accessible to us. The Jack and Hammer does undergo renovations at some point, and the paint color must be a throwback because that original description said that blue was its original color, but then it has been cream, and now it has been tarted up by Dick Scroggs, who is the publican. The impetus is the opening of a rival pub, the Blue Parrot, with a Casablanca theme that begins to draw away clientele, which is inexplicable given its inconvenient location, the dreadful beer brewed on premises, and the awful food that all tastes the same regardless of what Arabic-sounding name it is given. Every time they go there, what the featured thing on the menu is, something that turns out to be the same thing they had before under another name. Although we are assured that all the pubs that gave their names to the books once existed somewhere, though in some cases that was more than 40 years ago, even giving Grimes the benefit of the doubt, this assurance may be taken with a grain of salt. As she pointed out, some have changed their names, and of course some have inevitably closed, perhaps so long ago that even the long reach of the internet does not dredge them up. Aside from the Jack and Hammer, however, there is one pub that is candidly acknowledged as fictitious, and we'll get to that in due course. So some of these pubs you're going to see are real pubs. Some of them are real pubs in a different place. Some are pubs in the same place with a slightly different name, and then some were invented entirely. There definitely have been pubs named the Man with a Load of Mischief, or at least the Man Loaded with Mischief. The best known were a pair in Cambridge with a sign, of which this is a rendering, not the original, based on one originally painted by Hogarth, as the slide says. On the sign, we are told, the bowed hero center is chained by a padlock, marked wedlock in case you missed the point, to the overdressed, gin-swilling trollop on his shoulders. On the right is a pawnbroker's shop where the family kettle is being pawned. On the left is a pigsty with the inscription on the roof, she's as drunk as a sow. The magpie is emblematic of a gossip or chatterbox, and of course monkeys are known for trouble. The Man with a Load of Mischief is just one of the many pubs mentioned in the book. By the time Richard Jury arrives on the scene, murders have been committed both here and at the Jack and Hammer, where the body of the victim has been substituted for the Jack. And before it is over, several more will turn up at various other pubs. Moreover, one of the victims is a vicar, Denzil Smith, described as the village repository of old scraps of history, both village and extra-village, a walking book of memorabilia. And he contributes a lot of interesting information about pub names. For example, the Cock and Bottle. Most people assume the word's some sort of corruption of cork, which would make more sense, but it isn't. Cock was a word they used for spigot, the sort which would be found on a keg, So it was really meant to advertise draft beer, with the bottle standing for bottled beer. Now, if there was ever a pub named the Old Fox Deceived, I could find no trace of it, but I did think it was interesting that when a pub could no longer sell alcohol, it became the Old Fox with his teeth drawn. And again, this sign is one that was created for the German television series because there is no pub with that name. Okay, buckle up because there's a lot of background on this one. On the slide, you see the text of a note on the title page of the book, which refers to the frontispiece on the next page. There is a lot of information available online about anodyne necklaces, which were composed of peony buds, like the modern one shown in the illustration. They were supposed to cure illness, especially in infants, and my first impression was that this was just a type of teething ring. Though apparently the peony root does have some medicinal value. The chief quack who hawked these necklaces was a Dr. Chamberlain, and they were widely popular. Both the necklaces themselves and the pamphlets advertising them were available in several locations, one of which was up one pair of stairs at the sign of this necklace near the Rose Tavern without Temple Bar. I am very skeptical that there was ever a pub named the Anodyne Necklace, as this sign seems to be associated entirely with shops where this supposed panacea was for sale, and it would have been the Rose Tavern that was actually the pub. The Dirty Duck is one of the pubs that does definitely exist. Some of you may even have been there. Lost my place. It has existed as a pub since 1738 and has been known as the Black Swan since 1776, though it may have been given this name earlier. The Dirty Duck was a jocular nickname used by locals. Now, however, it goes by both names, the Dirty Duck being the public bar and the Black Swan being the saloon bar or restaurant. According to its website, our pub is the only one in England to be registered under two names. In fact, both pub signs are visible hanging back to back in front of our pub. If you approach from the direction of Hall's Croft, you'll see the Black Swan sign. And if you stroll up Waterside after seeing an unforgettable play at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, you'll see the Dirty Duck sign. Jerusalem Inn was another pub I couldn't verify, but Ye Olde Trip to Jerusalem claims to be the oldest pub in England, founded in 1189. Of course, it's nowhere near the pub in the book, but an interesting pub. So that will suffice for the Jerusalem Inn. Grimes sets her Help the Poor Struggler in Devon, but the interesting one I found was in Manchester. It had the distinction of being owned by a public executioner. A 2019 article in the Greater Manchester News is headlined, "The Smiling Pub Landlord from Oldham Who Killed 400 People." The article relates his career, which included hanging Nazi war criminals, and notes that his worlds collided when he had to hang one of his favorite former customers, and he ultimately gave up this side job. Another pub that appears in Help the Poor Struggler is named the Five Alls, which was evidently a popular pub name, as evidenced by the various signs shown on the slide, though actually the original name for these pubs was the Four Alls, because of the tagline, "For All." In this book, however, Grimes invents another variation. One character says, "Take the name of the pub where this string of killings started, the Five Alls." The sign is usually divided so you see these five figures representing authority. I pray for all. That'd be a priest or other symbol of the church. I plead for all, barrister or solicitor. I fight for all, military, right? I rule all. A lot of positions fit that. And I take all. Interesting, that figure. Sometimes the Five Alls sign says, I pay for all, meaning king, queen, and country. Other times the fifth figure is John Bull, who pays for all, and that's what we have on these. But in our Dorchester Five Alls, the fifth figure is the devil, who takes all, like lives. In this book, the Deer Leap is in Ashdown Dean, a fictitious town in Hampshire, but the only one I could find with that exact name is the one shown in Exmouth, now called the Bath House. There are other pubs called the Deer's Leap, but this was the only one I could find that had actually been called the Deer Leap, and none of the others were obviously in Ashdown Dean since it's fictitious. Here at last is a pub that is still in existence just where Grimes put it, a pub with a long history and a name worthy of a Grimes novel, although in these hurry-up times it has been abbreviated to the Only Running Footman and is generally referred to as just the Footman. But it has been around since 1749, and the name used to be the longest pub name in London, although now there's a vogue for long, ridiculous pub names, so that's no longer the case. In case you don't know what a running footman is, here is an explanation. To put this in perspective, the average marathon runner averages 6 to 8 miles per hour, and elite professionals can do 11 to 13 miles per hour or more. I have difficulty walking anywhere near 4 miles an hour, so I was pretty impressed that somebody could run for 8 miles per hour. But the footmen, as it says, were employed to run ahead of a carriage to ensure the way was clear, and as roads got better, they were no longer needed. The Five Bells and Bladebone is another pub that was exactly where Grimes said it was. Alas, in 2000, it was redecorated and renamed 5B Urban Bar. You can see the center photo there shows its rather dreadful appearance. In one of her public appearances, Grimes gave this as an example of a pub that had been changed and modernized as a gastropub, though that didn't last either. It is now out of business. Another real pub, this one in Bronte country. As for the legend that the innkeepers sheltered Bonnie Prince Charlie, there's a nice piece in the book about that. While Melrose waited for jury, he moved about the lounge and looked above flickering lights and little shaded lamps at pictures and brass ornaments, an account of the origin of the Old Silence name. Melrose sighed. It was one of those Bonnie Prince Charlie tales. The inn was yet another of those historic places that had offered Charlie refuge, and in this case, the silence of the locals. Given all the stopovers the young pretender had made, Melrose wondered how he ever got to his destination. He'd certainly clocked up a lot of traveling time. Melrose closed his eyes and imagined the prince traveling with Agatha. The Old Silent would have gone nameless, which of course refers to Agatha's relentless chatter. Grimes herself has a good story about the pub. Asked whether she ever asks permission to use the pub name, she replied, "No, I don't need to, for one thing. And for another, I hate to introduce myself as a writer. But for the Old Silent, I thought I would tell them. So I went to the bar where the manager was wiping glasses. They always seem to be wiping glasses. I gave my name and told the manager I was writing a book and would like to use the name in the book. He just kept wiping and finally said, 'Suit yourself.' It's obvious he was really excited. I've never asked since." Grimes places the Old Contemptibles in Cumbria, but the real pub is in Birmingham. The pub takes its name from the British Expeditionary Force of World War I, who proudly adopted the term the Old Contemptibles after Kaiser Wilhelm II reportedly referred to them as that contemptible little army. The pub itself has seen many identities through the centuries, originally opening as the Adelphi Wine Vaults in the late 1700s, becoming the Albion Hotel in 1880, and finally adopting its current name in 1953 in honor of the war veterans who once gathered there. And the plaque that is shown was placed in Westminster Abbey in 1993, honoring the Old Contemptibles. One of the most interesting pubs, not least because it is in the United States, is the Horse You Came In On. Grimes has said that the only reason part of this book is set in Baltimore is that I saw this pub sign. This pub, popularly known today as the Horse, was founded in 1775 and was supposedly Edgar Allan Poe's last destination before his mysterious death. In addition to being Baltimore's oldest saloon, it is the only bar in Maryland to exist before, during, and after Prohibition. It operates as America's oldest continually operated saloon. It was operating as Allen Ann's when owner Howard Gerber bought it. He had been looking for a location to own a pub, and this one appealed to him. He said, "When my partner and I opened this place in 1972, we wanted to give this an English pub feel. We got a list of hundreds of names of English pubs, and somehow this name always suggested itself, which is interesting because I can't find any evidence of an English pub with this name." And another article tells it like this: "We wanted something so unique that people walking by would say, 'We have to go in there.'" The idea of playing off of a saucy curse caught Gerber's fantasy, and little equine karma clinched it. When he got lucky enough at Pimlico racetrack to afford his down payment, he figured that was all the sign he needed, and the horse you came in on it was. And one of the things I thought was kind of interesting was that the bar stools are made to look like saddles. Rainbow's End is another pub that Grimes gets almost right. The location is correct, even if the name is imaginative, because this pub is actually called Rainbow on the Lake. In any case, the pub barely features in the book, which mostly takes place in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where Grimes had a second home. But this is a nice-looking pub. This one at least has a fun story. I couldn't find a single pub named The Case Has Altered, much less in Lincolnshire, where Grimes cites hers, but there are quite a few named The Case Is Altered. The most interesting one, I thought, is in Bentley, a suburb of Ipswich, Suffolk. It's been suggested that there has been a pub in Case Lane since 1736, though not necessarily in the current building. However, it is believed that The Case Is Altered certainly operated out of its current premises throughout the 19th century. There are various ingenious and often implausible explanations for the name of each of the pubs, many of which have to do with a legal case. One of two for the Bentley case was that the pub was once held by a genial landlady who was not too fussy about payment for beer, but when she got married, the case was altered. But here are some fun things about the Bentley case. In 2025, it was rated third friendliest pub in England by TripAdvisor reviewers, scoring 8.22 out of 10. And in 2011, the building was put up for sale by its then owner after several years of declining trade, closed in 2012, opened briefly under a new manager in 2013, and the villagers were determined to preserve one of their few remaining amenities. So a group of them formed the Save the Case campaign, and with a lot of red tape, formation of a nonprofit society, and energetic fundraising, they were able to purchase the pub, which is run by a cooperative. Jury first spots the Stargazer and a mysterious woman coming out of it from the upper level of a number 14 Fulham Road bus. And that's why I chose this Google Street View image, which actually shows the Hollywood Road side of the building because it includes one of the iconic red double-decker buses. When Jury later visits the pub, he sees a postcard from another pub of the same name, this one in Cornwall. And I did find a Stargazy Inn and a Stargazy Bar and Grill in Cornwall. And the postcard has a photo of Stargazy pie, which is described as a traditional Cornish savory pie featuring whole fish, usually pilchards or sardines, baked with their heads protruding through the pastry crust, making them appear to gaze at the stars. Traditionally includes eggs, potatoes, and a creamy sauce, and originated in the village of Mousel to commemorate a fisherman who braved a storm to bring back food. The fish heads are for presentation, and the fish are typically skinned and boned for easier eating. But this was a novelty to Jury. I had actually heard of Stargazer pie before because in 2018, when I presented Ladies in Lavender at Consanguinity, that was one of the things that appeared in that. The Lamorna Wink is another one that's real. It is in Lamorna Cove in Penzance in Cornwall. Grimes says that John le Carré suggested the title when he and Grimes were teaching at Johns Hopkins. People give you suggestions all the time, but not being John le Carré, they are very rarely right, she said. There are varying explanations for the name. One website says the pub is an old Kiddlywink, which was a small pub only licensed to sell beer or cider. But Wikipedia says that the name of Lamorna's pub, the Wink, alludes to smuggling, the wink being a signal that contraband could be obtained. And a third authority tells us apparently winks were a kind of establishment that fell somewhere between a house and a pub and had different licensing regulations as such. The version I heard was that you had to wink when you asked for your drink if you wanted the special. Asked, do you ever get feedback from the pubs, Grimes replied, I am the only running footman is aware because it's in Mayfair, a section of London that gets a lot of tourists who will tell the manager they've come there because they read the book. A friend was on a walking tour and came to the morning wink. When he was in the pub, he asked whoever was behind the counter if they knew an American writer had used this pub as a setting for a book. The one behind the counter just laughed and said, didn't send us a free copy, did she? You just can't win. The Blue Last is a pub that actually exists, though in the book it was in a different location and actually was destroyed in the Blitz, so it wouldn't have been this one. It might have looked like this, probably not. This is a very distinctive and very old pub, and in fact, has been rebuilt, but it has been around for a while. The Grave Maurice is another pub that has fallen on sad times. It's been there since the 1720s on a lease dating from 1670. Name probably commemorates Prince Maurice of the Palatinate, who fought on the royalist side in the English Civil War. Its location across the street from the Royal London Hospital made it convenient for Melrose and others visiting jury in hospital after his brush with death at the end of the Blue Last. It closed in 2010 and by 2014 had been converted for 2 shops below flats, and it now houses a pawnbroker and a betting shop. Now, this is a nice one. There was no pub in the village of South Petherwin for 150 years after the former pub, the Arbuthnot Arms, was bought by the Methodist community and closed down. Then the Winds of Change was purpose-built in 1989 by John Wills, a farmer in the village who decided to change to a hostelry owner. The subsequent pub owners, Mike and Val Ratcliffe, had a son and daughter who were not interested in carrying on the business, so they sold it at some point, and the new owner has renamed it the Frog and Bucket. The Old Wine Shades first appears in the book that bears its name, but is revisited in several subsequent ones. It is another very old pub. Indeed, legend has it that Dickens drank there. In the first book, Jury says to Harry Johnson, with whom he has struck up a conversation, with all the wine on offer here, I still didn't realize we were in a wine bar. Harry smiled. The proprietor prefers wine tavern. It avoids all the connotations of wine bar. The hooray Henrys, the young business tycoons dressed in parasuits, pinstripes, mobiles glued to their ears, and drinking wine out of a cardboard box. Very old pub, and the tunnel, which I'm going to show you here. As you can see, the name is actually the Oldie Wine Shades. And in the Black Cat, apparently someone had pointed this out to Grimes in the interim. And in the Black Cat, where Grimes meets Harry Johnson there again, Harry had taken out his cigarette case and extracted a cigarette, which Trevor lit for him with a match from an Oldie Wine Shades matchbook. Jury had never noticed the E on the end of that fussy oldie before. The pub was, however, very old. It dated back to the Great Fire. Not many buildings standing in London could claim that antiquity. And, of course, it is a real place. With Dust, we enter a much more modern era, as Dust is actually a club rather than a pub. And indeed, it may not even have been in existence in the era before 2000 when these books were set, although its building is obviously older. In any case, it didn't last long after the book was published. After a dust-up involving gunshots in 2007, its license was revoked for 28 days and it closed permanently in January 2011. The Black Cat is another real location, and in fact, the murdered woman in the book was discovered sitting at a table like this on the patio, shown on the slide. In December 2024, this notice was posted on the website. After nearly 5 years of closure, probably partly from COVID, we are embarking on a mission to bring this old and unloved pub back to the condition it deserves. At the moment, we are closed and we have significant renovation works to undertake throughout the site. They expected to be open by July 11th, 2005, but the website has not been updated, and the last post on its Facebook page was in June 2025, and as of January 1st, 2026, it was reported permanently closed, which is what happens. I mean, you can look around in Fairhope and see how things open and close. This is another real one, though it too is now closed. It was certainly a dramatic venue, but it was quite expensive, and some of the reviews were very unfavorable, such as this one. So when I finally get to Vertigo 42, the highest of them all, I'm expecting to have some kind of Leonardo DiCaprio on Titanic, I'm the king of the world moment. What greeted us instead was an awkwardly lit space the size of a hallway that wraps 3/4 of the way around the top of the tower. Cheap-looking coupled purple and green pleather seats seemed hastily stuffed into the window nooks. Heaven forbid you should come with more than 2 friends, lest you end up having to play rock, paper, scissors to see who will be the odd one out. Other reviews were more complimentary, but ultimately, despite the novelty, it was probably too expensive for frequent visits. This would not be your pub that you went to all the time. The Knowledge was probably my favorite of all the books, and when I read it last June, that was when I decided on this book review. I enjoyed it just as much when I reread it in December. Grimes sets up the premise in The Black Cap when Jury hails a cab. There were a couple of cabs moving along the Clerkenwell Road directly in front of him. He flagged one down, shoved the mobile back in his pocket, and opened the door. "You know Bidwell Street? It's near..." The driver smiled. "I know it." Jury pulled the door shut and fell back against the seat, or gravity pushed him back. Yes, they knew them all, these drivers. Every last inch of street, road, alley, courtyard, all of it, plus every shortcut. It's amazing what you drivers know. The driver laughed. It's called The Knowledge. You know. Jury nodded. There ought to be a pub by that name, The Knowledge. Maybe there is. So, in The Knowledge, we get the explanation about how these drivers have to pass this very, very difficult test to get their cab license. And claimed to be one of the hardest in the world. And the premise of the book is that a cabbie, Morris Benbow, had thought that in all of his years as a black cab driver, he had seen dozens of red lions, king's heads, crowns, white harts, and horses among London's over 5,000 pubs. But out of all the silly, weird, wondrous names that had been thought up, from the hung, drawn, and quartered to I am the only running footman, he had never passed one called The Knowledge. And this despite the fame of London's black cab and the belief that this city had the best drivers in the world. Still, not one pub with that name. So Morris decided to fix that. So when he finds himself in a location so out of the way he doesn't even know how he got there, and he doesn't know where he is, and he finds an empty building, he realizes that this is the perfect place for the pub, a location that only black cab drivers could find. So when passengers ask for it, because it becomes known that there is such a pub, and so people will get in the cab and say, "Take me to The Knowledge," they intentionally misunderstand and take them on a wild goose chase to, "Oh, I thought you said something else." And I won't spoil it for you, but it turns out that one of our characters does actually sort of succeed. The Old Success is another real pub, and the characters do go there, but it doesn't play much part in this book. It is in Penzance, again in Cornwall. There are a lot of the books that are set in Cornwall. This is where the series really breaks down. The premise is that there's a pub in Twickenham called the Queen that is being redecorated. After a murder is committed there, it is discovered that someone has borrowed the painter's ladder to add red to the sign, making it the Red Queen. But there is no pub called the Queen in Twickenham, and even if Grimes meant the Crown, it doesn't have a sign hanging in front, as far as I can see. But that's not all that's wrong with this book. The murder was committed with a rifle in one chapter, a shotgun in another, and neither is entirely plausible since the shot was made through a window by someone standing on a ladder. Characters come and go in bewildering ways, and some chapters seem to be out of order. Some reviewers speculated that the book had been written by an AI. Honestly, I think a good AI could have done a much better job. It is a shame to end this series and this review on this note. And it probably is the end of the series. Grimes was 94 when this was published, so we probably can't expect any more. But I can't really recommend it. I can recommend the rest of the series, though, if you enjoy amusing characters and dialogue and interesting locations and are not too hung up on plot, but do start at the beginning and get to know the characters. Thank you.